Prophecy is one of the most interesting elements of the world of Ice and Fire, and the way in which author George R.R. Martin actually uses it as a storytelling device makes it even more fascinating and meaningful. Within A Song of Ice and Fire, prophecies play a massive role in the actual series of events that take place. But when it comes to nearly every significant prophecy in the story, what has a greater impact on the world at large is how people who are aware of these prophecies interpret them, oftentimes misinterpret them, and what choices they make in relation to their beliefs about these prophecies, rather than what the true meaning behind these foretellings really are. Given the incorporation of Aegon's previously unmentioned prophecy into House of the Dragon, and the confirmation that this idea is a concept coming from George R.R. Martin himself that has yet to be integrated into the larger storyline, it is a complete game changer for the entire fantasy world in which this multitude of stories takes place. And it casts the entire reign of House Targaryen and the actions of the Targaryens themselves in an incredibly complex and fascinating light. Thus far, Aegon's prophecy seems to be fairly straightforward and simple, although House of the Dragon may elaborate on it further down the line. The crux of the issue is an unsurprising one, as Aegon foresaw the ice threat coming from beyond the wall, and had some sort of dream or vision that told him that Westeros needed to be united under a Targaryen ruler in order to defeat this apocalyptic danger. But House of the Dragon has already built in a great deal of compelling and extremely relevant subtext surrounding this idea, and when expanded to apply to the entirety of House Targaryen, it becomes an even more exciting plot device. House of the Dragon's pilot episode ends with a montage of Rhaenyra being informed about this threat while also being named as Viserys' heir. And the richness and depth of this entire sequence is very easy to miss upon first watching, but it very deftly demonstrates the power of prophecy. One element that makes revelatory visions such an interesting concept is that they have both a negative and positive angle to their interpretation, as they focus on something that both must happen and will happen. The immediate presumption is that what has been seen will ultimately come to pass, but the people who are privy to these prophecies are also under the impression that they must do the right things in order for the final result to be the right outcome. And, as House of the Dragon very cleverly demonstrated immediately, both the flexibility and certainty of prophetic interpretation largely relies on these two foundational but bizarrely conflicting cornerstones. The revelation of Aegon's prediction seems somewhat out of place at first glance, but the series of events that preceded it actually became immediately more telling as soon as Viserys explained this concept to Rhaenyra. Undeniably, one of the most jarring and horrific elements of the episode was the brutal death of Aemma Arryn, and Viserys' actions take on an entirely different appearance within the context of this prophecy. Because again, he is operating under the assumption that Aegon's vision both will happen and must happen. His actions towards Aemma are callous and brutal, but they actually make a great deal more sense with the understanding that Viserys both believes that he must have a son and heir who will be capable of leading all of Westeros in a battle against an apocalyptic threat, and believes that he will have such an heir. Although the options that he has presented offer him a possible means of saving his unborn son, he makes that choice under the impression that his son without a doubt will live, simply because that's what the prophecy requires, at least according to his interpretation. If there's no way of saving Aemma, then the son inside of her must be the heir that Viserys has been hoping for. Of course, Viserys' assumptions end up being wrong, and Balon dies not long after his mother Aemma. However, the series of events immediately following this are a fantastic and succinct insight into the bizarre nature of prophecy and how it drives people forward. Because when Viserys' presumed outcomes do not come to pass, he simply changes his beliefs about the prophecy in order to make it fit the options that he has available to him. Based on his behavior and the behavior of Rhaenyra prior to Viserys' decision to name her as his heir, it seems obvious that she was never a plausible possibility for his heir until she had to be. Interestingly, although he presents the prophecy to her as a vision that a Targaryen king or queen had to be on the Iron Throne in order to save the realm, it seems obvious that Viserys' prior understanding of the prediction necessitated a king on the throne specifically. If it hadn't, then it makes no sense that he would never have considered Rhaenyra as a potential heir until now. However, because he has no other living heirs, he immediately alters his interpretation of the prophecy to suit his circumstances. Because these events both must and will come to pass, then Rhaenyra must have been the real heir all along. This is a beyond spectacular insight into the nature of prophetic visions and what they will drive people to do, as well as the incredibly fluid nature of prophetic interpretation. Viserys is initially presented as a weak-willed but seemingly kind and caring person, and he's willing to cut his own wife in half without giving her the chance to have any input, to say goodbye to her daughter, or even giving her the chance to understand what is happening to her, because he is under the impression that what he's doing is for the good of all mankind. And he is immediately proven wrong, because the son that he believed he was saving dies anyway. Viserys' actions and seemingly callous choice makes far more sense and is actually far more horrifying within the context of his knowledge of Aegon's foretelling. He can make that decision so easily because he believes it's a necessity for the future of all Westeros. But when he's demonstrably proven wrong, instead of internalizing the possibility that all of his assumptions could be wrong, he simply changes the goalposts. When Viserys' beliefs are fundamentally challenged by the death of his wife and son, he alters those beliefs to fit his present options. With Aemma and Balon's deaths, he decides that Rhaenyra must have been the correct heir all along. But if we're to assume that's true, then that was always true. Meaning that all of the suffering that Aemma Arryn went through in her attempts to provide Viserys with a male heir, as well as the horrific death we all just witnessed, was for absolutely no reason. But of course, that reality seems to be completely lost on, or willfully ignored by Viserys. This opens up a great deal of questions and possibilities beyond this specific case and incident as well. Firstly, Viserys' prophetic pivot towards his supposed realization that Rhaenyra was the real right heir all along only serves to make the prophecy itself even more suspect. Viserys essentially alters the foundation of the prophecy to suit his personal beliefs and needs, which of course begs the question of how many times that has already happened before. Viserys seemingly incorporates the possibility of a Targaryen queen being the leader who will save Westeros from an icy apocalypse, so it's only natural to wonder how many times this Targaryen game of telephone has already changed the prophecy itself as well as the meaning behind it. But what likely makes it even more interesting on a micro and macro storytelling level is what becomes acceptable through the lens of an apocalyptic prophecy. Again, as we can see from the start, Viserys doesn't seem to be an unusually callous, cruel, or malevolent person. And yet he takes almost no time at all to justify brutalizing and killing a wife he seemed to love in order to serve what he believes is the needs of all humanity. There's a fascinating shade of Azor Ahai and Nissa to this entire event, and the fact that House of the Dragon went out of its way to show the gruesome, horrifying, and ultimately pointless realities of sacrificing someone else in order to serve the realm or save humanity feels incredibly pointed. When the story of sacrificing the one you love in order to save the world is framed in a high fantasy way, it's much easier to swallow than when you're literally watching a helpless and clueless woman being held down and cut apart because her husband believes that it's for the greater good. And clearly, it is much easier to swallow when operating under the assumption that it truly is for the greater good. But as was immediately demonstrated with Aemma, it oftentimes is not for the greater good. Aemma Arryn spent years suffering through failed pregnancies and was ultimately maimed and killed because her husband wholeheartedly believed in a prophecy that he objectively had to have interpreted incorrectly. And Viserys Targaryen spent his entire adult lifetime essentially torturing his beloved wife because he was operating under the false assumption that she would both give him the heir that he wanted and that her pain and ultimately her death was a worthy price for the benefit of the future of humankind. Again, oftentimes the true relevance of a prophecy in the world of ice and fire is not the prophecy itself, but what people are willing to do when they believe in a prophecy. And what can go horribly wrong when that prophecy is misinterpreted, which it is more often than not. Ergo, framing Viserys and the entirety of House Targaryen in this way straight out of the gate is a very narratively rich and intriguing starting point. But what makes it even better is the effect that the existence of this prophecy has on the entire story going forward, as well as the entire story preceding it. Aemma's brutal death and the introduction of the formerly unknown prophecy of a Targaryen leader destined to lead Westeros in a war against the Ice Apocalypse were undeniably two of the most controversial elements of the start of the story. However, they're actually two of the most pointed and thematically relevant moments that seem incredibly indicative of what kind of story is truly going to be told here. Viserys has obviously made his choices as a king with the perceived responsibility of the future of the entire continent, and potentially the entire human race, hanging over his head. And it would seem that many Targaryen rulers that came before or after him have made all of their decisions operating under the same belief. And both fascinatingly and terrifyingly, Viserys' choices are some of the least interesting decisions that were likely driven by this imagined destiny, which is something I'll delve into in the next installment of Aegon's prophecy analysis. But what do you think? Does Viserys' decision, and more importantly his behavior regarding Aemma, radically change within the context of his belief about Aegon's prophecy? And is his ability to mold his assumptions about said prophecy around his available options an indication of the unreliability of his and the other Targaryens' interpretations of it? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.